Good afternoon, and welcome to ITIF's event today on how intellectual property has played a pivotal role in the global COVID-19 response. Today, we're releasing a new report that talks about how a range of 10 innovations, everything from vaccines and therapeutics to respirators, sidewalk delivery robots, and Zoom, have played a critical role in helping shepherd society through the past 14 months of the global pandemic. I'm Stephen Ezel, Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. As we get going, let me note that you may submit questions through the Slido application, which is found at the bottom of the ITIF webpage for this event, and we'll take questions in the last half hour of today's session. Just to quickly cover our run of show, we'll first hear opening keynote remarks from Representative Brad Schneider of Illinois, have a presentation of the report from my colleague Jackie McDowell, hear presentations and comments from our panelists, and then open the floor to Q&A. I'll introduce our panel after remarks from Brad Schneider, who we will turn to now. Brad Schneider represents Illinois' 10th district, which is the northeast corner of the state, the northern suburbs of Chicago, bordering Wisconsin. He's serving his fourth term in the House. He is a member of the House Committee on Ways and Means, as well as the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Prior to being elected to Congress, Brad worked for 20 years in business and management consulting fields. Brad, thank you for being with us today and offering some pre-recorded remarks.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Congressman Brad Schneider, and I am happy to be here with you. Thanks to intellectual property advancements, the United States has transformed into a global leader in vaccinations. Every American should be proud that the most effective, widely available COVID vaccines have been created in our country. Our scientists, researchers, and public health experts have been working around the clock to develop a vaccine that is safe, effective, and our best hope for beating back this virus. Our country's leadership in life sciences, R&D, and innovation have given hope to all Americans that we can soon have life return to normal. We cannot successfully defeat this pandemic, however, without ensuring that in addition to vaccinating everyone here at home, we vaccinate the entire global population. Many countries are still desperate for the vaccines, and the United States has a moral responsibility to ensure equitable access and distribution across the globe. However, eliminating intellectual property protections is not the best way to achieve that goal. Rather, we should continue to do everything we can to promote technological innovation and advancement across the world. We must foster public-private partnerships that will expand vaccine access and distribution around the world and continue to chart our path forward in beating back this virus. We must pursue innovative efforts to solve our current and future challenges in public health, workplaces, and society. Thank you again for having me, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you, Representative Schneider, for those opening remarks. So turning to our panel, we will first hear today from Professor Mark Schultz, who is Director of the Intellectual Property Program and Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company Endowed Chair in Intellectual Property Law at the University of Akron Law School. Prior to joining the Akron Law School, Mark was a professor at Southern Illinois University School of Law for 16 years, was a co-founder with Jackie of the Institute for Intellectual Property Research, and was co-founder and leader of the Center for Protection of Intellectual Property, CPIP, at George Mason University in Washington, D.C., where he remains a non-resident senior scholar. Jackie McDowell is a senior policy analyst at ITIF, covering intellectual property and innovation policy issues. She focuses on IP and its correlations with global innovation and trade. She, in the past, has worked on ITIF's Innovate for Health initiatives, and she holds a JD with a specialization in intellectual property from Southern Illinois University. After Jackie, we'll hear from two of the entrepreneurs whose case studies are featured in our report. The first is Ati Hindla. He is the CEO and CTO at Starship Technologies, a maker of autonomous delivery robots. Ati is a passionate technologist. He was developing computer programs since the age of 10, or by the age of 10 actually, and in 2013 he designed a robot to compete in a NASA contest to find a soil sample retrieval robot for Mars missions, an effort that inspired the Starship robots. He was a founding engineer and chief technical architect at Skype before founding Starship Technologies. After Ati, we'll hear from Jason Trotner, who was a serial entrepreneur who has been a co-founder or C-suite executive of at least 3 venture capital-backed healthcare technology companies. First as the founding CTO of Cast21, then as Chief Operating Officer of Legit AI, and now as the founding CEO of the MIT spin-out TIL Bio. He'll talk about the innovative TIL Bio respirator developed during the pandemic. Jason holds a master's in mechanical engineering from MIT, as well as an MBA from the MIT Sloan School of Management. Lastly, joining us later today at 1:30 due to conflict is Andrew Iancu. He is the former Undersecretary of Commerce for Intellectual Property and, of course, Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, the PTO. There, he oversaw one of the largest IP offices in the world, and he founded the National Council for Expanding American Innovation. Prior to his government service, Andre spent 2 decades at the IP law firm Earl & Manila and served as the firm's managing partner from 2012 to 2018. He's also a guest lecturer on patent law at his alma mater, the UCLA Law School. With that, we're excited to hear from our panel today. Mark, let me turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm always happy to be working with ITIF. So today I'll be talking about the role that intellectual property has played at every stage in the fight against COVID-19. Next. So I've been writing and talking about this topic for over 13 months. And the reason I have been is because there's been skepticism at every stage regarding the role of intellectual property. First, skeptics claim that IP would block basic research and collaboration in the development of a vaccine. Second, that IP would create needless competition, complications, and blocking and actually delivering a product. And now where we are today, many claim that intellectual property is a problem with respect to manufacturing and distributing doses worldwide. Why do people believe this? Well, next slide. I think it's partly the most charitable thing I can say is I think there's a misconception about how innovation works. And I don't mean to make a straw man argument. This is about the most sense I can make out of many of these arguments. I think there's a mistaken understanding that invention is incentivized and supported by intellectual property, but once invention happens, well, the rest is easy. People will beat a path to your door. The invention will miraculously find its way to consumers or patients. And really, we don't need intellectual property rights once we have that great thing we need. And maybe if it would be better if we could find a way where we didn't even have to incentivize the first step with intellectual property rights. Next slide. So this is a fundamental mistake about how innovation works. There's really 3 parts to the process of getting a new product to consumers or of treatment to patients. Next slide. Really, there is that first step of invention. And it's not as simple as sitting down at a computer and sweating it out. It's often a long and fraught process, taking billions of dollars in investment. And yes, that investment is secured by intellectual property rights. It doesn't happen. People don't want to make that investment unless they have some promise of success, some security, not a guarantee of success, but some security that if there is a success, they'll get a return on their investment. But it doesn't stop when you have a product, when you have an invention, whether it be in the laboratory or the workshop or somebody's garage. You don't have a product at that point that consumers can use. If it's a medical treatment, you don't have anything that's approved for by regulatory authorities. So next, you have to develop a product that can actually get into consumers' hands. This is what a company like Apple excels at when you think about the consumer product market. They take stuff that other people have invented in the past, and they actually make it into things we use, like smartphones and tablets. Those were around for a while, but not popular. Finally, though, the last step of getting products to people is really challenging. Manufacturing at its scale is a tough proposition. And when we look at COVID-19 treatments, when we look at vaccines, the manufacturing is happening at an unprecedented scale. We're trying to get the product to virtually every human being on the planet. Next slide. So what intellectual property rights help to do is several things. They support the investment. and they allow people to collaborate, to hand the ball off step by step as they create a tradable asset embodied in the intellectual property. A university can license a startup to develop a product. The startup can then take its intellectual property and sell it to, say, a big pharma company, which then can take it through the regulatory approval process and get it to consumers. At every step, the work is spread out, and so is the risk. And importantly, the risk is privatized and distributed. And yes, the gain is too through intellectual property rights, but having intellectual property helps the whole system work. Next step. Next. And so let's apply this three-step framework to the COVID-19 story. Next. So we could tell the COVID-19 story, COVID-19 vaccine story, in a way that plays into that misconception I described. We could tell it like it's kind of easy. Dr. Derrick Rossi, the academic founder of Moderna, one day he read a paper by Drs. Katalin Kariko and Dr. Drew Weissman about possibilities for using synthetic mRNA. A light bulb went on. It led to the founding of Moderna. Moderna did some work for a while, and when the pandemic rolled around, Moderna was there waiting and ready, and within 45 days, they brought a vaccine to market, the first COVID-19 vaccine, not to market, I'm sorry, to human trials in 45 days. And a year later, they're well on their way to manufacturing 1 billion doses. It's a great story. It's a tremendous story, and we shouldn't overlook how challenging each step of that story is. So let's complicate things a little. Next slide. Okay, so mRNA, using synthetic mRNA for vaccines is hardly an overnight success. The scientific community has known about mRNA since 1961. Since at least the early 70s, some researchers have had the idea that we could create synthetic mRNA, introduce it to human cells. The mRNA would then instruct the human cells to create proteins that would trigger our immune system, which would then create antibodies that could fight potentially cancer, viruses, as in the case of COVID-19, and other things. This was a great idea. It took decades to come to fruition. And for the researcher most identified with the idea, Dr. Katalin Kariko, it was hardly a triumphant procession from success to success. It was quite the opposite. She was frequently rejected in her funding applications. At one point, she was demoted by the University of Pennsylvania. There were many dead ends. It took many years of struggle, and it was almost a career dead end for her. But she persisted. And next slide. And she and others, particularly she and others in the academic community, as well as in the startup community, addressed some of the major challenges with adapting mRNA technology to the vaccines we know today. First of all, the synthetic mRNA was fragile. They had to find a way to strengthen it so that it could actually make its way into human cells intact. Once it got into human cells, initially, the body had a really strong reaction, rejecting the synthetic mRNA. We couldn't have gotten the antibodies we wanted because it was such a strong inflammatory reaction. So it took decades of research, and it took billions of dollars of public and private investment, particularly private investment, first by venture capitalists and then by the public capital markets, before companies like Moderna and BioNTech were ready to produce a vaccine. Next slide. Next, okay. Right, next. Okay, so it took many years, and in fact, they had not brought a vaccine to market. mRNA technology was the first use of mRNA technology in a treatment has been this past year, and the vaccines we're fortunate to have now. Just over a year ago, about 15 months ago, before the pandemic, I was doing an academic research and had the opportunity to talk to Dr. Derrick Rossi about the importance of intellectual property in life sciences startups. I guess neither of us knew just what was coming and how important one of the companies he helped found, Moderna, would be. But we talked about intellectual property. And these insights have have echoed so greatly throughout the year since the 14, 15 months since I talked to him. See, first we talked about the role of intellectual property. Now, as an intellectual property professor, I think it's kind of the be-all, end-all. But from Dr. Rossi's point of view, great science is what's important. But he says intellectual property is what enables great science to ultimately create treatments that get to patients and solve problems. Why? Because you need investment, and you don't get investment without the intellectual property that gives the security to the investors. I asked him something important that many critics of IP seem to believe, in, at least implicitly, some explicitly. Couldn't we just have the government do this? Do we really need these private companies? And he kind of scoffed at the idea. He said, not a chance. You know, academic researchers do academic research. The government does things that governments do well. But it's the commercial ecosystem that really delivers treatments. And it's many different people making a tremendous investment that is supported by intellectual property. But even getting the product, which required this tremendous investment, getting a treatment that could go into people's arms isn't the end of the story. Next slide. See, creating the vaccine was just the first step. This vaccine had never been manufactured at scale. I've talked to Pfizer executives, and they've told me the story that of what a tremendous feat, they didn't call it that, but it really was, of manufacturing the vaccine. You see, their supply chain and the ingredients had only been manufactured for experimental purposes, for testing purposes. Now they needed to manufacture ultimately billions of doses. And to do that, they had to stand up a supply chain to supply novel ingredients. They had to retool manufacturing facilities. They had to quickly develop know-how to develop steps in the manufacturing process. All of this constitutes a tremendous investment that is, once again, backed by intellectual property. And ultimately, Pfizer made that investment. They took the risk. They manufactured hundreds of millions of doses before the product was even fully tested and approved. So they were ready on day one of approval to put it into people's arms. This was also an investment backed by intellectual property. And one final point about what intellectual property has done here is that Pfizer has worked with contract manufacturers. They're even working with rivals, including Merck, to manufacture the vaccine, to get the doses out to people as quickly as possible. They're teaching their competitors how to make the vaccine. And why are they able to do that? They're able to do that because they have a certain amount of security, because they know they have intellectual property rights and contract rights that, at least where the rule of law prevails, protects them in sharing this knowledge. Next slide. And in sharing this knowledge, they can have trust that their rivals won't be able to turn it against them, that they're not being fools, they're being good collaborators. They're doing what makes sense commercially and morally to get the vaccine to as many people as possible without having their investment appropriated from them. And this is really important security. So ultimately, last slide. Ultimately, what we're able to do, what we've been able to do in the past year, not we, I can't take credit, but what our scientific community, our commercial pharmaceutical innovators, our public institutions working with them have been able to do is really almost a miracle. And it has all been enabled by, first of all, as Dr. Derrick Rossi would tell you, enabled by great science and really brilliant people working around the clock under tremendously demanding conditions. But they've been able to do that because they've been backed by the security of intellectual property rights, which has secured their investment of time, resources, and money in doing all of these things. Thank you. And next, I'll hand it over to Jackie McDowell. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mark. And it's a pleasure to join you and the rest of our distinguished panelists this afternoon. As Stephen already said, my name is Jackie McDowell, and I am the Senior Policy Analyst for IP and Innovation for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. ITIF is an independent, nonpartisan research and education institute that focuses on the intersection of technological innovation and public policy. and we are honored to be the world's top think tank for science and tech policy, according to the University of Pennsylvania's Global Go-To Think Tank Index. If you want to learn more about ITIF or the work that we do, you can visit itif.org. On Monday, April 26, 2021, we marked the 21st celebration of World IP Day, an event dedicated to increasing awareness and understanding of intellectual property. And this is why we are here today. ITIF is releasing a report co-authored by Stephen Zell and myself titled 10 Ways IP Has Enabled Innovations That Have Helped Sustain the World Through the Pandemic. The challenges of the pandemic have been numerous and broad. In addition to the obvious healthcare challenges associated with COVID-19, mental health, cancer screenings, nursing homes, and general healthcare upkeep have all taken a hit during these trying times. Social interaction changed. The way we work changed. And in many cases, businesses faced drastic adaptation in order to survive. Our report highlights only 10 of the countless innovations worldwide that are meeting the challenges brought on by the pandemic. A vaccine from India, the world's first fully approved COVID-19 therapeutic, a diagnostic test from the UK that provides highly accurate results in 12 minutes, a reusable translucent silicone rubber respirator, which Jason can share more on later, a portable isolation chamber developed by a paramedic in Mexico, and virtual reality training for surgeons. But as I said, the challenges have been numerous and broad, and the innovation does not stop with biopharma or biotech. Those facing anxiety or depression could find comfort in a realistic robotic puppy. Safe, contactless delivery might be just one autonomous delivery robot away, as Adi can share with you in a moment. Contact tracing and social distancing at work, even in the most challenging of situations like construction sites, is just an IoT system away. And remote work and social interactions are possible with innovations such as video conferencing. All of these innovations have been enabled by IP. Without IP protection, innovators have little incentive to undertake the risky, difficult, expensive, and time-consuming process of creating new-to-the-world innovations. Many also would not be able to do so on the massive and global scale that is necessary for fighting a pandemic. As you heard from Mark, and you'll hear from the entrepreneurs joining us today, IP is just as important for startups as it is for large companies. Intangible assets, including IP rights, accounted for approximately 84%, or $21 trillion worth, of the corporate value of S&P 500 companies in 2018. For startups, this means IP is vital for generating capital. Whether it's capital or revenue, companies must have something on hand before they can invest in researching, developing, manufacturing, and marketing products. A 2021 joint study by the EU Intellectual Property Office and the European Patent Office shows IP-intensive industries contribute 45% of EU GDP. That's 6.6 trillion euros, or about 7.9 trillion US dollars. IP-intensive industries also account either directly or indirectly for 38.9% of employment in the EU. And IP generates higher wages and greater revenue per employee, especially for small to medium-sized enterprises. The same goes for the US, where IP-intensive industries support at least 45 million jobs and contribute more than 38.2% of GDP. And as the case studies show, IP supports a broad range of industries, all of which are working to meet the various challenges brought on by the pandemic. Throughout the pandemic, the world has seen rivals and unlikely allies team up through voluntary licensing agreements. These agreements have provided biopharmaceutical manufacturers with assurances and the means to scale up globally. For example, Bharat Biotech has teamed up with the US-based Ocugen to produce Covaxin. In November 2020, Lumira DX partnered with the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator, and several other organizations to provide 55 African Union member states with portable diagnostic instruments and related COVID-19 antigen tests. Likewise, Gilead expanded its manufacturing network to include more than 40 contract manufacturers across North America, Europe, and Asia. The company has signed non-exclusive and royalty-free voluntary licensing agreements with generic pharmaceutical manufacturers based in Egypt, India, and Pakistan, which allow the companies to manufacture remdesivir for distribution in 127 countries. The agreements give the manufacturers the ability to set their own prices. And since May 2020, more than 2.3 million eligible patients throughout the developing world have been given access to remdesivir through this program. This has been particularly important during the recent surge in COVID-19 cases in India, where Gilead is providing technical assistance to support the accelerated production of generic remdesivir. In addition to donating at least 450,000 vials of remdesivir to address immediate needs, Gilead is working with its 7 Indian voluntary licensees, helping to increase their batch sizes, add new manufacturing facilities, and onboard local manufacturers throughout the country. Voluntary licensing agreements have also played a role in maintaining quality control within the supply chain. This is especially important given the rise in counterfeit products related to COVID-19. Many of you have likely seen the recent articles discussing counterfeit products discovered in Poland, Mexico, and South Africa. Collaborative efforts between law enforcement and manufacturers have kept numerous counterfeits from reaching the population, including here in the US, where the National Intellectual Property Rights Coordination Center recovered $48 million worth of counterfeit PPE and other products. Much of the current discussion concerning IP ignores the fact that IP protection can be, and most often is, used for purposes other than litigation, including generating initial capital, identifying partners to help scale up manufacturing, and ensuring the quality control of products. Our report, 10 Ways IP has Enabled Innovations That Have Helped Sustain the World Through the Pandemic, shows the positive impact IP has had on innovation meeting these challenges. My contact information is on the screen should you have any questions, but for now, I am going to turn things over to Adi so he can share more on Starship Technologies. Adi.
Hello, everybody. I'm honored to be in front of this audience. To introduce myself, so I'm Adi Heinle. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Starship Technologies, and we are building sidewalk delivery robots. I have a small video to show you that introduces you to the concept and what are we doing and what our robots are capable of. So let's watch the video first, and I will discuss how this relates to the COVID.
The delivery robots are amazing.
I must have used the service 50, 60 times.
When I haven't got time to go out, if I'm working from home, it's great to have lunch.
I can order what I want, what I need, and actually just sit back and track my robot to my front door.
They can bring the delivery in a very short time.
Quite often I end up working from home. Sometimes you don't have the time to go out and get a pint of milk so that you can actually have a cup of tea while you're on your calls. I find Starship really great to be able to just fit in with my lifestyle. It means I can really focus in on doing my work.
My wife, amazingly, has donated a kidney so that I can receive a kidney. With both of us out of action and unable to drive, it's been brilliant just being able to pop onto the app, order the things you need, without having to trouble anybody else, without having to walk to the shop.
We trust that they always get here because there's never been a problem. Every time we've ordered something, it's always arrived promptly.
I had guests coming over from Birmingham. When I was putting everything together, I realised I'd forgotten the yogurt. Robots to the rescue, and the robots were here before the guests came.
If I do a big shop, half my food just goes to waste. So I just buy small amounts, and actually this allows me to do it.
Less cars, less pollution, it's green and it's good for the environment.
We are very proud of these robots. We've got videos and we show them around to people.
Thank you, Mr. Robot.
I don't have to take time off work, I don't have to go to the shops.
Just knowing that whatever you need is just a few clicks away on an app and it arrives outside your house, so why would anybody not use it?
It's turned into where it's becoming a necessity, an essential service for people, where it's now famous.
All right, so this was a little bit of a quick introduction to how sidewalk robot delivery works. And we have been working on this for quite some years, and it probably feels to a customer a little bit magical that they order something using an app and a robot shows up. But there has been a lot of technology and a lot of IP that has gone into making this reality. A little bit like self-driving cars is a huge research effort, a huge technology development effort. How does this relate to the pandemic? Obviously, a lot of us will have or have had to isolate in our homes during a long time now. And right, you can isolate in your home, but you do need food, you do need groceries, and you can get that, you can order that using many different services available, but you also have this handoff process where you meet the courier, right? How do you do contactless deliveries? A truly contactless delivery is with a robot. So it works like that the grocery store or the restaurant puts the food or groceries into the robot, and the robot drives autonomously to your doorstep, and you take it from the robot. So you have no human contact during that time. So that's how Starship Technologies has been able to help the communities during the pandemic to cope with all of the new lifestyle that we have had to live during that time. And people got used to that, and they have stayed with us, ordering with our service throughout all of this time. There are, of course, a lot of robots being built in the world, and for a lot of different purposes. But there are actually very few robots that are operating at scale. And I think at Starship, we would not really have been able to help the communities if we were not ready to scale. It's relatively easy to develop a robot that drives autonomously a little bit, and you can film it and you can post it to YouTube, and you can show that, hey, this robot drives and it works and so forth. But it's a completely another thing to prepare something for scale, to have everything worked out from safety to the operational details, the maintenance of the robots, how the robots behave, the unit economics, all of it. It has taken years for Starship to develop its technology, and when the pandemic hit, we were ready to scale. We have now completed more than 1.5 million deliveries, so 1.5 million deliveries. So some people think, robots, this could be a gimmick, it could be interesting once, but it's not like that. We are at scale. We are doing this in the millions. We are doing thousands and thousands of deliveries every day, and we are accelerating. Just in January, we announced that we completed our millionth delivery. Now it's 1.5 million. So 500,000 in just a couple of months. Services like this really can help communities cope with the pandemic and adopt the new lifestyle. We started the neighborhood delivery service in Milton Keynes, where this video was shot. That is a city in UK. We have since rolled out in other cities in UK, and recently, last year, in the end of last year, also rolled out in the US, in the city of Modesto, California, in partnership with the Save Mart supermarkets. And our services has been available in the US college campuses, and we are signing up new college campuses every week by now. So the pandemic has accelerated our uptake, and we have been accelerated in our ability to scale by intellectual property that we have developed. This has been important in the development of our company. And if you think about how things move around in the cities, a lot of times, you go to a store or restaurant to pick up something. You drive there, you drive a big car there, you pick up something and you drive back to your home or to your office. And yes, of course, you can pay to a courier to do that. But at Starship Technologies, we set out to automate this process, to make sure that things can move around automatically in the same way as electricity comes to your home or to your office, or water comes to your home or your office. If you need water, nowadays you just walk to the tap, you turn the tap, right? You get water. If you want milk, you can't do that. If you want milk, you actually need to go to the store. Wouldn't it be nice if we can also get milk automatically? Well, maybe not by turning a tap, but by ordering it with a robot. That's how Starship Technologies is helping the world and is shaping the world. And we are building a future where things can move automatically that then frees up time from people and is good for the environment. Obviously, moving a big car takes a lot more energy than moving a small sidewalk robot. In fact, I think our robots use less energy than you would use while you walk to your nearest store. So our technology is ready to scale, and we are ready here to help you. Thank you. I think the next presentation will be by Jason Troutner, who will talk about other exciting stuff.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone at ITIF and to all the other panelists. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Jason Troutner. I'm the president and co-founder of Teal Bio. We're a relatively young startup spun out of MIT and Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, and we are commercializing a reusable N95 respirator system that was developed near the beginning of 2020. I have one of our prototypes here, a reusable system with a fully autoclavable, sterilizable reusable component, and then these interchangeable filters. This is a product that was originally conceptualized by the research groups of Professor Giovanni Traverso and Professor Bob Langer at MIT and the Brigham, with the goal of providing more reusable respiratory protection to healthcare workers, especially in the face of shortages of raw materials and of personal protective equipment. Some of the other panelists have already touched a little bit on examples of uses of IP beyond probably what I think is the most well understood component of incentivizing R&D. I'm going to kind of continue that line of thought and talk specifically about how IP rights are used as a bridge between an existing idea and getting that idea to patients. Specifically, I'll be talking about medical devices because that's my personal experience, both as president and co-founder of Teal Bio and previously as co-founder of Cast21, which is an advanced waterproof orthopedic cast and splinting company based out of Chicago. So of course, the general concept that I think most people think about and learn about in school as it relates to the purpose of patents is that the reward of having a monopoly in the market justifies an upfront investment. When a big company is budgeting for their R&D department, can say, okay, we're going to put X amount of dollars in here because we're going to get Y amount of dollars out. That sort of necessarily begs some additional questions about, okay, once that IP has been developed, then what? Especially in these cases that we've seen in the past year of trying to do whatever it takes to get helpful, often life-saving technologies out to the public to get the help out there. One question that gets brought up occasionally is, should institutions, academic institutions, governments force innovators to involuntarily give up their rights to the intellectual property that they develop? There's the report that Jackie and Stephen talked about that comes out today has what I think is a wonderful analogy of Charlie Brown, running up to kick the football and Lucy pulling it out. That kind of risk that exists in someone's mind once you've done that once you've pulled out someone's rights that they were counting on using as a part of their commercialization once. Are they worried about that in the future? As an entrepreneur, I call that policy risk, which is a very real thing in startups, probably most pointedly in the example of like clean tech startups. Imagine being a clean tech investor like in October 2020. Part of you has to be wondering, oh God, what if that guy gets another term? You're always thinking about how is policy going to affect the viability of what you're trying to do in the market. Then the other option is voluntarily. If the innovator chooses, wants to get this out to the market, is that something that is going to help to remove that barrier? It's actually something that the very first mask that was developed by the group that eventually developed the product that turned into Teal Bio was a mask that was called iMask. It was published in BMJ Open, covered internationally on all the major news stations, and the designs were voluntarily made available to the public with the goal of allowing this to get out as far as possible. In practice, that kind of action and choice with hardware products, especially in medical technology, it's a lot harder to do that successfully than with something like software, where make the code available to anybody, download it, and anyone can actually get the value out of it. And to explain that a little bit more, I want to look a little bit closer at the process to get from some existing intellectual property in medtech to actually reaching the patients who need it. And, there's this sort of chasm that you have to get over. There's a lot of costs that exist in getting from a proof of concept to a quality product. There's regulatory costs, there's manufacturing setup costs, and for all these reasons, a lot of really good technology, especially in medtech, ends up sitting on a shelf, gets developed in some academic lab, and then sort of dies in this path from there to market. The ones that make it are very often launched through spinning out companies like Teal Bio. And what's interesting is IP is a very important part at this stage of a company, but I've never heard a good entrepreneur talk about IP at this stage as it relates to enforcement, as it relates to blocking other people out of the market. The way that it comes up is sort of working backwards from the end goal. The end goal is the product reaches the patients who need it. And in order to reach the patients, we need quite a lot of funding to get through all these steps that I mentioned previously. To get that funding, we need to demonstrate to an investor a viable path from where we are to acquisition. And in order to demonstrate that is where IP comes in, because at the acquisition from a larger company, the acquirers are going to care about the intellectual property. Additionally, it's important when talking to investors because at the very early stages, as Jackie mentioned in her presentation, IP makes up quite a lot of what you have. When you start, you pretty much have an idea and you have a team. There are a select number of people in the world who are successful enough, impressive enough that they can really win on just their own personalities and convince somebody to invest in them on their own personalities. I don't have that type of personality. But if there's intellectual property behind the idea that we're bringing to market, there's some reason to believe that we might be successful and an investor can end up backing us. And so in that way, we've worked backwards from the end goal of getting to patients, but that process to get over that big chasm is from idea to IP, to showing a viable exit, to getting the funding, and then using that funding to get the product to the market. And so with the second mask that was developed by the research group at MIT and Brigham and Women's Hospital, we did end up spinning that technology out into what is now Teal Bio. And there's IP there both from the academic institutions and IP that's been developed at Teal Bio, which has allowed us to raise the funding, and now we're on our way to market in such a way that, you know, the open source, freely available IP process, you know, doesn't always work. It's been done a couple times, but I personally haven't seen an example in medical technology. I believe my contact info will be made available after this. If anyone has an example, I'd love to know. And so then what do we actually do about this? You know, if we want to reach as many people as possible, or if we are worried about some of the very real negative and harmful things that can be done with intellectual property, I have not come here with a prepared policy solution of what should everybody do. But what I have is sort of the framework of how I, as an entrepreneur, think about intellectual property, which is that at least specifically in medical technology, IP isn't some wall in the middle of a field where you're only blocking people out from getting to the other side, and you tear that down and everyone has access to this wonderful thing that you've created. In medtech, it feels often more like a chasm that you're bridging, and you use IP to bridge this chasm. And in that sense, it's not a perfect bridge. It's a bridge one person can cross. But if, as an innovator, as an institution, as a government, you have a reason why you want to allow more people across, if you burn down that bridge, you better build another one. And so don't think that rolling back voluntarily or involuntarily intellectual property protection is going to solve your problem of everyone getting access. Build another path there. That's what I don't have an answer to, but is the line of thought that I encourage you to start thinking about. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to the next speaker, who will be Andre Yanku. Thank you.
All right, great to see everybody. Thank you, Jason, and really what an honor and privilege to be here with all of you. I want to take a little bit of time and talk about the overall theme at the higher level policy, from a higher level policy perspective, about the role of intellectual property in the COVID-19 response, and frankly, when it comes to any major innovation, and especially in the medical fields. So what I believe the past, let's say 12 to 18 months have demonstrated is that our intellectual property systems, both here in the United States, but frankly globally, have been working at their peak. They have been demonstrating their true benefits, and they really have resulted in incredibly fast innovation that is addressing a worldwide pandemic in record time. So first of all, the fact that we are able to have multiple vaccines, several in the United States, several others around the world, developed and approved in less than 12 months, and more to come, is absolutely remarkable. And it didn't happen out of the blue. It's not it didn't happen by itself. It's not a coincidence that it happened this quickly. It's never been like this before. And it's frankly the result of years of innovation, of development, and of allowing inventors and investors to pour a lot of time, talent, and resources into creating these technologies that ultimately we were able to piggyback on and develop the specific applications to the COVID-19 virus. So that clearly is the primary benefit of the intellectual property system, which is to incentivize and create dynamic innovation that builds upon itself, improvement upon improvement, to advance the state of the human condition at forever increasing rates. The second incredible benefit that we are seeing in action right now is the transfer of technology between companies, between countries, and the like, and the collaboration that takes place in industry. So we see hundreds of collaboration agreements in industry right now when it comes to the COVID-19 vaccine, and with respect to many other technologies applicable to COVID-19. We see major competitors being able to collaborate with each other. For example, Pfizer collaborating with Novartis, Johnson & Johnson collaborating with Merck, AstraZeneca collaborating with the Serum Institute of India. Smaller companies being able to collaborate and transfer technology with the big companies such as BioNTech and Pfizer in the first place for that vaccine. Without IP, companies would find it more difficult to engage in this type of collaboration. Companies are willing to do it and to share their technology because they feel secure that their technology and their rights are protected. Without IP, companies usually retreat into their trade secret shells, and they keep a lot of that technology to themselves. Think, for example, about the Coca-Cola formula, which has been around for a long time, well over 100 years. It's secret to them. They're the only ones who can do it. You can't imagine Coca-Cola sharing its formula with Pepsi, for example, so that they can make it in Pepsi factories. But here, because we have the use of patents and the like, companies feel secure in that transfer and collaboration. There is a suggestion nowadays, not a suggestion, but an actual proposal to waive intellectual property rights at the WTO on the international stage, because the proponents are stating that by doing so, we will enable more collaboration and more the ability of more entities around the world to make these technologies. It is, in my view, that is, in my view, a very dangerous proposition. Waiving intellectual property rights and waiving the protections afforded by the TRIPS agreement would be irresponsible. Before we do anything like that, we need to ask at a minimum 2 questions. First of all, is it necessary to do so? Is there actual concrete evidence that intellectual property protections are hampering the dissemination of technology at this time when it comes to COVID-19? As I said, I believe there is no such evidence. In fact, the evidence is to the contrary. Because of IP protection, we are seeing more collaboration in this field than ever before. And in fact, we already know that 1 billion vaccines have been doses have already been made around the world. There will be a 2 billion by the end of May. And the estimate is that by the end of this calendar year, by the end of 2021, we will have 9 or 10 billion doses of vaccine. And if that comes true, it would be enough to vaccinate the entire adult population of the world. And this is in fact enabled by companies already collaborating with each other under the protections of intellectual property. So so that's question number one. Where is the evidence that it is needed to blow up the IP ecosystems around the world? Second question, even if we were to do this, will waiving intellectual property rights achieve its intended result? And where is the evidence that that would happen? Again, the evidence is to the contrary. The systems have been working with unprecedented development at unprecedented rates, and collaborations, both domestic and international, at unprecedented rates. You know, here is the bottom line. Humanity does not know progress as we are used to it today without the modern intellectual property systems. The fact is that humans have been on this planet for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps. Civilizations certainly have been around for thousands of years. But the rate of progress that we have experienced in the last couple, 200-300 years has been absolutely unprecedented anywhere around the world or at any time in history. At all this time, we've had robust intellectual property protections. Be very careful before breaking that up. There is no example in history to date that we can succeed as a nation or as humanity in general without these intellectual property protections. So if folks are proposing that we do something else, they better have the evidence that that new approach would be successful. The innovation ecosystems have been working. And what we have to make sure is that continuing with the respect for IP, with the respect for the rule of law, because that is what will enable us to continue to achieve the greatest heights of human development. You know, back in 1878, Thomas Edison, it was said of Thomas Edison, so Thomas Edison, you know, everybody knows him, great American inventor. And for a long time, he was the #1 patent holder in the United States with well over 1,000 patents. Prolific inventor. It was said of him back contemporaneously in 1878 that Thomas Edison, quote, with his marvelous inventions, is pushing the whole world ahead in its march to the highest civilization. That is what inventors do. That is what the intellectual property systems allow inventors to do. They have been working incredibly well, and with inventors, as we have seen on the panel today, and so many others, I think we are in great shape, not only as a nation, but as humanity in general. So thank you again very much. I look forward to the oncoming discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Iancu, and to Jackie, Mark, Jason, and Ati for your wonderful presentations. Most appreciated. Let me remind our audience that we do welcome questions via the Slido application on the webpage, and great to see that we already have a number of questions coming in. So thank you, keep them coming. Perhaps we'll start with one that might be more for the entrepreneurs on the panel, but it's, you know, effectively, would you have been able to have successfully innovated in the absence of intellectual property rights with your companies?
I can start there, and I kind of alluded to some of this in the discussion, but there's a certain level to which you can always take an idea in the absence of intellectual property rights, and of course it varies from type of product to type of product. The products that I've worked with have been nowhere near as expensive to develop as things like pharmaceuticals or vaccines, but a whole lot more expensive than making, another social media app. And so with all of those, basically as far as my credit card can reach is as far as I can get in the absence of intellectual property. And from there, someone else has to fund it. And that's when the questions start arising.
Great. Thank you, Jason.
Right. I would also offer my answer. I think the innovation and technology development would happen, one way or another, and did also happen before intellectual property laws. But I think the business around it would work differently. I'm not here to speculate how it would work, but imagine, for example, a world where there would be no legal penalty for example, stealing somebody's design, somebody's software, and just using it, just setting up a completely different company, just completely copycatting, your idea, your technology, your drawings, whatever. I think the business would work differently. And I'm not sure if I would love to, work in a business like that. I think, of course, there are, ways to do it one way or another. But in this sort of cutthroat world where you can just steal whatever you want, I think that would be a quite different thing.
Thank you. Well, Mark and Andre, y'all in your work have pointed out that it really was the creation of intellectual property rights, the Berne Convention, for instance, that was, as Douglas North written about, was really the great inflection point towards greater economic growth globally, was when we started to create intellectual property rights. If Mark or Andre, you want to expand on some of the work I know you've done on this topic.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So absolutely, there's no question. There's always been innovation in human history, but just put things in context, okay? About 250 years ago, before the modern intellectual property systems, think about the state of the human condition just at the end of the 18th century, okay? In let's say 1800, okay, or 1799. Certainly, we would not have been having a conference by video conference, okay? We would have had no lights. We would have been meeting by candlelight. We would have had to meet in person, and we would have gotten there by horseback, if at all. And if we had to send a message, forget using, I don't know, let's say, because I have Ahti here, let's say we couldn't send a message by Skype. You would have to send carrier pigeon. That's 200 years ago. And that was no different than in ancient Rome. If you wanted anesthesia 200 years ago, you had to have a shot of whiskey. And just 200 years ago, despite the fact that we had human civilizations, we had the ancient Romans, the Greeks, the ancient Chinese, Aztecs, Mayans, you could go on and on. So the fact is that maybe we can imagine another system. I'm sure that a group of intelligent folks can come up with another potential system. My only point is that so far, we don't have the evidence of it. And before we try to disrupt, especially in the middle of a pandemic, something that's working, we have to be really careful that we know what we're doing.
Right. So one thing that economists sometimes say charmingly is that well, first we've all heard economists say there's no such thing as a free lunch, but there's an exception to that rule. The only free lunch is innovation. Without innovation, you're just taking assets and shuffling them around, maybe getting more ruthlessly efficient, but you're never going to do more than you're doing now. You might do other things. You might squeeze some costs out of what you're doing, but without innovation, you don't change fundamentally what you do. And as Andre discussed, we've been able to change fundamentally what we do. We've gone from taking thousands of man hours to produce an acre of wheat to dozens of man hours in a century and a half. And those people and those work hours have been put to more productive and exciting uses than subsistence farming. And that's the change in the human condition. But we don't get the investment that drives the innovation so far without the intellectual property system. And really, when you start to look at what we get in exchange from those investments we make, all the complaints about intellectual property candidly start to seem petty. I can't minimize them right now when we're talking about costs of treatments, and anyone who needs a treatment who can't afford it, that's terrible. But if we look from the 30,000-foot view, anytime anyone talks about the monopoly cost of intellectual property, et cetera, it just pales against what we as the human race get in exchange for incentivizing that innovation. The dynamic change we get out of it is just incredible and exciting when you actually look at it. Intellectual property rights are probably the best bargain that the human race has ever invented in terms of what it gets in return from this policy creation.
Great. All right, let me present two related questions from the audience. I'll read them at once and welcome comments. This not surprisingly, us being a Washington think tank, attraction policy questions might be more appropriate for Jackie Marker. First question, do you need intellectual property rights for government-funded research, such as in Biden's proposed health ARPA? Question two, innovation is becoming more important for the Biden administration, but the US also seeks to contribute more to global public health. How should America's IP protection strategy look like in that context?
So you don't need intellectual property rights for government-funded research because people will happily take government money to do research. What you need intellectual property rights for is if you want to get them off the shelf and want anything to happen with them, if you want products that go to consumers and treatments that go to patients, then you need intellectual property rights. And this is what drove the Bayh-Dole Act. This is the tremendous insight behind the underlying the Bayh-Dole Act in the late 70s. The US had funded billions of dollars worth of research and had very little in terms of practical applications to show for it.
As late as 1978, as many as 30,000 technologies set on the shelf. The government had essentially, patent less than 5% of commercial technologies.
Absolutely. So yeah, and that's the bottom line, is that if you want somebody who knows how to take a product to market, you need to license it out. You need to take that basic research, as I said, Dr. Derrick Rossi, the founder of Moderna, said, academic researchers, as my slide said, academic researchers are good at doing academic research. People who work, at NIH and other institutes, they do tremendous work, but they're not CEOs. They're not Ati or Jason. They don't want to do that work. It will never get to consumers or patients if you don't have intellectual property rights and have a private market that does that work.
Yeah. So
Go ahead, Jackie, and then Andre.
Sure.
Jackie, go ahead if you had a comment on that.
Yeah. Go ahead, JC.
Sorry, just kind of piggybacking on what Mark said and kind of reiterating one of the other points that I had said before is that, one of the things with IP is that it helps with the quality control. So getting it into the market is definitely important, but you also need that IP so that once it's there, you can make sure that you're tracking and that we're not ending up with a ton of counterfeit and products that are potentially harmful to the population.
Great.
That is such a good point. And in fact, it's another reason why I believe that waiving the TRIPS agreement, IP protections under the TRIPS agreement is irresponsible, because especially for vaccines and other drugs that go into human bodies, how are we going to know that things that are made without those quality controls will be safe and effective? To address those the two specific questions, Stephen, I agree with Mark. You know, you don't need IPs per se to do research with government funds, but if you want to have any impact with that research in the real world, you absolutely need IP. Because ultimately, and it's not, you know, ultimately the key is to transfer that technology from the lab to the market, and to actually give the public a benefit for the investment that they have made. So if the technology, it's a little bit counterintuitive, if the technology has no IP protection on it, and some people say maybe that's better because anyone can then use it, it's a free-for-all. But boy, why would Ahti or Jason or any other entrepreneur take it and invest all the dollars and the time needed to create a business and build factories and build production lines, if as soon as they do that, the next competitor can just copy it and do the same thing? So I think it's absolutely critical that you have IP, and that's exactly right. Mark is exactly right on Bividol. And then it's the same thing for global health. Intellectual property protection is part of the solution. So it certainly spurs the original innovation, which the Biden administration and any other administration wants to do. And at the same time, it enables the cross-border collaborations to enable other countries and other markets to develop. It allows these domestic companies to make investments in other territories, secure that their technology will be protected, and then develop the local economies in those territories, and therefore improving in the long term global health.
Thank you, Andre. And just so I have my stat right, it was as late as 1978, the federal government had licensed less than 5% of the as many as 30,000 patents it owned. And indeed, Mark, you're right. When The Economist called the Bayh-Dole Act perhaps the most inspired piece of legislation that America had enacted over the past quarter century, when it was introduced in the early 1980s. And it's really had a remarkable effect on turning American universities into engines of innovation, with over 12,000 US startups as a result of academic patenting since 1995 alone. Yeah, research doesn't mean much if it just sits on a shelf and doesn't get commercialized and translated into products that make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Here's a slightly related question to this one. For innovations where R&D is publicly funded, is there data available on the private investment that funds scaling that innovation into a mass available product? Welcome any comments on that. I will say that we released a report last year called Understanding the Vital Importance of the Bayh-Dole Act to the U.S. Life Sciences Innovation System. And what research finds is pretty much that for every $1 of federal investment into basic life sciences R&D, the private sector is adding on average $100 more of investment into developing that kind of basic insight of how cellular mechanisms work, or the biomarkers in the body. There's at least 100-to-1 ratio of private investment that compounds the public investment to bring these technologies to product. But welcome to the comments.
Yeah, I was going to wait for someone to actually answer with data before I jump in, and so I appreciate that, Stephen, because what I have is anecdote and experience, and having done some of this myself and talked to many innovators connected to mostly academic research, often funded by the government, and the experience is typically, once you get past the basic science portion. I mentioned when I was talking about the big chasm that exists between the proof of concept that's good enough to get you published and a product that I can make millions of and actually get out to patients, that's where, the further you get, the closer you get to actually reaching patients, the less interested the government funding is and the more interested the private funding is. And so it may start entirely as government funding, then maybe there's some SBIR, STTR funding that comes in parallel with private funding. I'll say I know that private funders love seeing the presence of government funding. When you raise $250,000 in SBIR, you often get a whole lot more than that from the private funders because they see you got the money from the government. But it's a very interesting topic, and I understand the questions here because there's the sort of the trade-off of the system that we've demonstrated works in terms of taking this IP, putting it into a private entity, and seeing that that can successfully lead to a product on the market. But on the other hand, there's the very real and understandable objection to the idea that, research that was publicly funded by taxpayer dollars, that then those same taxpayers are paying monopoly prices on the product once it gets to the market. And so it's something where it's, morally, I totally subscribe to the idea that, if we're funding it as taxpayers, why is somebody else then, charging us absurd prices? But at the same time, I don't have another solution. Tearing down those protections, I haven't read a realistic sounding alternative.
I do think it's important. Welcome comments from the audience here. The public does not pay twice. The public is paying for two different things. The first thing the public is paying for is basic life sciences research, right? Into discovering, as I said, the cellular workings of diseases, the disease states in the body, right? That's a set of knowledge that creates a platform for innovation that then others in the private sector can go and build into actual real products, vaccines, therapeutics, what have you. And then you're paying for an actual drug. So this is a complete canard that the public is paying twice. They're in fact paying for two separate but extremely important different things. Mark, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, Andre, please.
No, please, Mark.
Oh, I was just saying one quick thought too is that there's a certain political economy to how all this works too. Sometimes the government does get more actively involved as an investor. And what you might expect if you really think about it, it happens. Those of us who are familiar with the venture capital world know that most investments fail and a lot of money's lost. And hey, that's the private sector. That's the risk you take when you're an investor. When the government makes those investments, what happens is inevitably some of those investments fail, but the failures become politicized. So the Obama administration made some investments in green tech. Inevitably, some of those companies in which they invested failed. It was called a political scandal. It was called a problem. It was something that I think anyone who's familiar with technology investment kind of shrugged and said, well, that's what happens. Startups fail. A lot of them do. But yet, when the government is involved, it becomes a political problem when you have that failure, and the taxpayers lose money. So it's better to leave the private sector take most of the risks and endure most of the failures, but also avoid the political controversy that comes with the government being so involved in trying to invest in spurring technology.
Great. So another question from the audience. Again, thank you for these great questions coming in. Perhaps maybe Jackie and Mark can lead on this one, and then Andre can comment additionally. But the question is, how can pharmaceutical and life sciences innovations more broadly be stimulated in Africa? This question should be considered beyond IP protection to also include kind of capability development in the sector. Jackie and Mark, maybe you could talk about kind of the work that we had done together with the Innovate for Health initiative, because I know we had some wonderful examples like the CardioPad from Africa there.
Jackie, would you like to describe that?
Yeah. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with the exact innovation that Stephen was mentioning, but there there has been a lot of innovation. Even with COVID, there has been a lot of innovation. A lot of the things that I was looking into for this particular report, there were actually several innovations coming out of Africa. But going along with some of the themes that we've already mentioned, a lot of it is not able to be scaled up because of the way that the system is set up, because of the lack of infrastructure, and they just don't have the manufacturing capabilities set in place at this particular moment in order to bring a lot of these products to the people that really need them. And so one of the things that can be done in that respect is to kind of scale up on infrastructure.
Right. So our Innovate for Health project focused on life sciences innovation in developing countries. And yes, what you're not seeing is perhaps necessarily the fundamental research that leads to the kind of biotech breakthroughs we're seeing in the US and Europe, but we're seeing life-changing innovation on the ground by entrepreneurs, like the cardiopad Steve described. This was an invention using
echocardiogram.
An echocardiogram using essentially an iPad, using a tablet that brought healthcare to people in remote locations in countries where you only had a handful of cardiologists. And this kind of innovation both helps patients and is designed for local challenges. Another one in Kenya we documented was PeakVid, which was used the iPhone, used smartphones, and it was essentially a lens added to a smartphone that brought the capabilities of an optometrist's office into the field, where technicians could do remote eye exams and help people in ways that they'd never been able to reach before. So these kind of locally driven innovations can happen in a country, but what we found is it was important to them scaling that there was some opportunity for intellectual property rights. Often they had to commercialize the invention in the US or Europe in order to get a return on the investment to then bring it home and actually use it in the field at home. But as Jackie described, infrastructure and the like, but yes, there are opportunities in developing countries. And if you look at our Innovate for Health project, you see all over the world, people are innovating in the life sciences, bringing applications to local communities that really need them. Health. The developing world is not just the receiver of innovation. They're not just the user of innovation. They are innovators themselves, and they will be greater innovators the more they are supported by the rule of law and intellectual property rights.
Maybe, Andre, you could briefly comment on maybe some of the work the United States has done to build kind of intellectual property confidence among governments in Africa. Because one of the things I thought was interesting with the cardiopad was that the Cameroonian developer, Arthur Zhang, said that if Cameroon, his country, hadn't joined the African Intellectual Property Organization and been secure that his intellectual property rights would have been protected in Cameroon, he would have not proceeded with developing his company and launching the cardiopad.
Yeah, these points are really great because so the United States has done quite a bit to help build the infrastructure that Jackie was talking about, and to provide incentives for companies to go into various countries around the world, Africa, but also many others around the world. To develop local capabilities. But what I want to make sure that that we communicate is the point that Mark was making, which is IP is key to this. It's not the other way around. There is this argument that's being made that IP is the thing that's preventing this broader based distribution of technologies in developing countries. It's exactly and maybe that's a gut level, more instinctual type of an argument to make and to understand, but the fact is it's the exact opposite. and we can do more to incentivize companies economically through trade agreements and the like to go in various places around the world. But none of that will happen if you don't have locally in each jurisdiction robust IP protections. So at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, we recognize that. And we spent a lot of time working with many countries, anyone who's interested, frankly, to develop their local intellectual property capabilities. We provide lots and lots of training. We provided more training, by the way, last year in 2020 during COVID than at any time in the past. Probably in part because we could do it via teleconference. We send examiners, for example, to be residents in those countries for a little while so that local folks can learn how to do things. And we help with the local jurisdictions developing their intellectual property laws. So what is key is for folks to recognize that they need to include IP capabilities in these trade deals in order for them to be successful.
Excellent, thank you. So as we have 5 minutes left, I want to do this in closing. First, we have a question from the audience, which maybe we'll make the last question, and we'll direct that to you, Andre. And then what I would like to do after this question is ask the panelists to wrap up with perhaps a closing thought, closing remarks, advice you might have for policymakers. Andre, the question is, grateful if one of the panelists would comment on whether or not they expect a shift in the U.S. position concerning the TRIPS paper proposal.
Well, I certainly hope not. The United States has so far not agreed to the waiver proposal. Neither have the European countries, Japan, Australia, Canada, and I'm hoping that the United States will continue to maintain this position for all the reasons that I have stated. I think we all have the goal, and I certainly share the goal of creating as many vaccine doses as possible and distributing them as broadly as possible around the world and as equitably as possible. It so happens, however, that I believe that waiving IP rights will harm that process, not help it. And for that reason, I hope that the U.S. maintains its current opposition.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's just conclude with a final closing remark from each of our panelists. Let's go in the order in which we had presentations today. So we'll start with you, Mark, then Jackie, Ati, and Jason. Mark, you're on mute.
I'll follow on what Andre said, and it appears that the White House today, Jen Psaki, made some remarks indicating that the Biden administration appears to understand this, that the world shares the priority of the Biden administration, and I hope Americans share the priority of helping the rest of the world get the vaccine doses it needs. What's happening in India is a tragedy right now, but we're not going to help it by undermining the system that got us to this place. We're not going to help it by trying to force companies to divulge their know-how and set up competitors, essentially. It's only going to interrupt them at the time they need to be most focused on producing vaccine doses, not caught up in legal fights and other distractions. So we need to continue on the course we're on and just work harder to ensure that everybody in the world gets the care they need as quickly as possible.
I'd just like everyone to remember something that Jason and I both touched on, that regardless of whether it's a large company or a small company, startup, or it's been around for a while, IP is very important for so many reasons and well beyond litigation. It's the purpose of IP is so much more than the stereotypical thoughts along what it is. And I think that's something that needs to be brought into the discussion a lot more.
I am just trying to continue my work in helping the world with our robots through the pandemic, delivering things to people's homes, and also delivering medical samples and COVID tests occasionally, which we have done in Germany. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, Jackie covered a lot of what I think the take-home message is, at least from me, and that at least from my perspective, in early stage medical technology, there's a lot more that IP has been used for. There's a whole ecosystem that's been developed based on the foundation of how the patent system works. And so any modifications, anything that is or any ways in which policymakers choose to use intellectual property should be taken with an understanding of all the related systems. And last thing, I'd like to make a plug for Jackie and Stephen's article that comes out today. I've read a good chunk of it so far. It's very well written, and I recommend everyone take a look at it.
Thank you, Jason. Andre.
I am extremely optimistic about the future. Look how far we have come and how quickly we have come to where we are now. And it's in very large part as a result of our incredible inventors and entrepreneurs, the incredible work that they do. And I hope folks realize that they do all of that work with a robust intellectual property system behind them, supporting all their work, their efforts, and their investments. And with a robust system in place, we will continue to achieve as a human race unbelievable heights. And I think the future is bright indeed. And I want to thank all of you for the incredible work that you do. And thanks for having me on this panel.
Well, thank you, Andre. And I do want to make a plug for the report. It's really great. Loved reading the stories of the delivery robots, the teal respirator, the robotic puppies, which actually is the Tom Bot and Jenny helped so many people, especially elderly, dealing with social distancing. So a lot of great case studies in there, the stories of how IP in a number of different unexpected ways was so critical in shepherding global society through this unprecedented pandemic, at least century-long unprecedented pandemic. But I particularly want to thank Ati and Jason for your willingness to allow us to profile your companies in our reports. Thank you for that. With that, I want to thank our audience for joining us today. I want to note that a video of this event will be posted on the ITIF webpage as well as ITIF's YouTube site by the end of the day. And I want to close by extending a hearty thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you all for being with us today. We look forward to continuing to work on innovations, both addressing the pandemic and driving global society forward. Thank you all.
Thank you.